Whether at sea level, the top of Mount Everest, or flying 100,000 feet in the air, the always horizontal horizon line always rises up to meet the eye level of the observer and remains perfectly flat. You can test for yourself on a beach or hilltop, in a large field or desert, aboard a hot air balloon or helicopter. You will see the panoramic horizon ascend with you and remain completely level all around. If the Earth were actually a big ball, however, the horizon should sink as you ascend, not rise to your eye level, and it would dip at each end of your periphery, not remain flat all around. Standing in a rising balloon, you would have to look downwards to the horizon. The highest point of the ball Earth would be directly beneath you and declining on each side. Amateurs have sent balloons to heights of over 121,000 feet, and you can watch video online of the horizon rising with the camera level and remaining perfectly flat 360 degrees around. NASA videos and other official sources, however, such as the recent Red Bull skydive at 128,000 feet, have been caught adding fake curvature to the Earth via wide-angle lenses and post-production work. Panoramic photos atop Mount Everest also often claim to be displaying Earth's curvature, but this is simply the result of distortions and limitations inherent in wide-angle lenses. Samuel Shenton wrote, "The camera-distorted horizons have always been a misleading factor with those who have not freed their minds from the planet or globe Earth indoctrination. 3 or 4 years ago, the USIS booklet Science Horizons carried a note to the effect that the Americans hoped to produce a lens which would not distort level horizons. So far, I am not aware that such aid to truer photography has yet been made available. Flat earthers, however, can prove that due to the known laws of perspective, the horizon optically rises and remains level with the observer's or the camera's eye, no matter what height is achieved. In fact, the Earth immediately beneath balloon, airplane, rocket, or capsule presents a dish-shaped or concave-like appearance, the point of Earth immediately below the vehicle appearing the lowest. It is not the highest point of your globe Earth, with the dip or curvature of the ball sweeping away downward to a horizon far away below the eye level. If the Earth were actually a big ball 25,000 miles in circumference, the horizon would be noticeably curved even at sea level, and everything on or approaching the horizon would appear to tilt backwards slightly from your perspective. Distant buildings along the horizon would all look like leaning towers of Pisa falling away from the observer. A hot air balloon taking off, then drifting steadily away from you on a ball Earth, would slowly and constantly appear to lean back more and more the farther away it flew, the bottom of the basket coming gradually into view as the top of the balloon disappears from sight. In reality, however, buildings, balloons, trees, people, anything and everything at right angles to the ground or horizon remains so regardless the distance of the observer. B. Chasbro wrote, "The marine horizon, from whatever position it is viewed, always appears to be, and is, in fact, a perfectly level line, and since this appearance is the same in all parts of the world, its surface must be level, and therefore the earth is a plane. This may be proved to be the case by erecting at a suitable elevation on the seashore a duly leveled board or a string, at right angles to a plumb line, tightly stretched between two vertical poles. On looking towards the sea, the horizontal line for a distance of 20 miles may be easily observed, and throughout its entire length it will be found to coincide with the straight edge or string. But if the earth were a globe, the horizontal line would form an arc of 20 miles in length, curveting both ways from the center, at the rate of 8 inches multiplied by the square of the distance. Hence the horizontal line at either end of the distance ought to be depressed some 66 feet below the horizon in the center. But as no such appearance is ever presented, it necessarily follows that the earth cannot be a globe, or other than a plane. Anyone can prove the sea horizon perfectly straight and the entire earth perfectly flat, using nothing more than a level, tripods, and a wooden plank. At any altitude above sea level, simply fix a 6 to 12 foot long, smooth leveled board edgewise upon tripods, and observe the skyline from eye level behind it. The distant horizon will always align perfectly parallel with the upper edge of the board. Furthermore, if you move in a half circle from one end of the board to the other whilst observing the skyline over the upper edge, you will be able to trace a clear, flat 10 to 20 miles depending on your altitude. This would be impossible if the Earth were a globe and the surface of water convex. If the Earth were actually a globe 25,000 miles in circumference, the horizon would align over the center of the board, but then gradually, noticeably, decline towards the extremities. Just 10 miles on each side would necessitate an easily visible curvature of 66.6 feet from each end to the center. Dr. Samuel Rowbotham wrote, "It is known that the horizon at sea, whatever distance it may extend to the right and left of the observer on land, always appears as a straight line. The following experiment has been tried in various parts of the country. At Brighton, on a rising ground near the racecourse, 2 poles were fixed in the earth 6 yards apart and directly opposite the sea. Between these poles a line was tightly stretched parallel to the horizon. From the center of the line the view embraced not less than 20 miles on each side, making a distance of 40 miles. A vessel was observed sailing directly westwards. The line cut the rigging a little above the bulwarks, which it did for several hours or until the vessel had sailed the whole distance of 40 miles. The ship coming into view from the east would have to ascend an inclined plane for 20 miles until it arrived at the center of the arc, whence it would have to descend for the same distance. The square of 20 miles, multiplied by 8 inches, gives 266 feet, as the amount the vessel would be below the line at the beginning and at the end of the 40 miles. From the high land near Portsmouth Harbour in Hampshire, England, looking across Spithead to the Isle of Wight, the entire base of the island, where water and land come together, composes a perfectly straight line 22 statute miles long. According to the ball-earth theory, the Isle of Wight should decline 80 feet from the center on each side to account for the necessary curvature. The crosshairs of a good theodolite directed there, however, have repeatedly shown the land and water line to be perfectly level. On a clear day from the high land near Douglas Harbour on the Isle of Man, the whole length of the coast of North Wales is often plainly visible to the naked eye. From the Point of Ayr at the mouth of the River Dee to Holyhead comprises a 50-mile stretch, which has also been repeatedly found to be perfectly horizontal. If the Earth actually had curvature of 8 inches per mile squared, as NASA and modern astronomy claim, the 50-mile length of Welsh coast, seen along the horizon in Liverpool Bay, would have to decline from the center point an easily detectable 416 feet on each side. Dr. Samuel Rowbotham wrote, "But as such declination or downward curvation cannot be detected, the conclusion is logically inevitable that it has no existence. Let the reader seriously ask whether any and what reason exists in nature to prevent the fall of more than 500 feet being visible to the eye, or incapable of detection by any optical or mathematical means whatsoever. This question is especially important when it is considered that at the same distance, and on the upper outline of the same land, changes of level of only a few yards extent are quickly and unmistakably perceptible. If a man is guided by evidence and reason, and influenced by a love of truth and consistency, he cannot longer maintain that the earth is a globe. He must feel that to do so is to war with the evidence of his senses, to deny that any importance attaches to the fact and experiment, to ignore entirely the value of logical process, and to cease to rely upon practical induction." Surveyors, engineers, and architects are never required to factor the supposed curvature of the earth into their projects, providing another proof the world is a plane, not a planet. Canals and railways, for example, are always cut and laid horizontally, often over hundreds of miles, without any allowance for curvature. One surveyor, Mr. T. Westwood, wrote in the January 1896 Earth Review magazine, stating that, "In leveling, I work from ordnance marks, or canal levels, to get the height above sea level. The puzzle to me used to be that over several miles each level was and is treated throughout its whole length as the same level from end to end, not the least allowance being made for curvature. One of the civil engineers in this district, after some amount of argument on each side as to the reason why no allowance for curvature was made, said he did not believe anybody would know the shape of the earth in this life. Another surveyor and engineer of 30 years wrote to the Birmingham Weekly Mercury, February 15, 1890, stating, "I am thoroughly acquainted with the theory and practice of civil engineering. However bigoted some of our professors may be in the theory of surveying according to the prescribed rules, yet it is well known amongst us that such theoretical measurements are incapable of any practical illustration. All our locomotives are designed to run on what may be regarded as true levels, or flats. There are, of course, partial inclines or gradients here and there, but they are always accurately defined and must be carefully traversed. But anything approaching to 8 inches in the mile, increasing as the square of the distance, could not be worked by any engine that was ever yet constructed. Taking one station with another all over England and Scotland, it may be stated that all the platforms are on the same relative level. The distance between eastern and western coasts of England may be set down as 300 miles. If the prescribed curvature was indeed as represented, the central stations at Rugby or Warwick ought to be close upon 3 miles higher than a cord drawn from the two extremities. If such was the case, there is not a driver or stoker within the kingdom that would be found to take charge of the train. We can only laugh at those of your readers who seriously give us credit for such venturesome exploits as running trains round spherical curves. Horizontal curves on levels are dangerous enough. Vertical curves would be 1,000 times worse, and with our rolling stock constructed as at present, physically impossible." Engineer W. Winkler wrote into the Earth Review, October 1893, regarding the Earth's supposed curvature, stating, "As an engineer of many years' standing, I saw that this absurd allowance is only permitted in school books. No engineer would dream of allowing anything of the kind. I have projected many miles of railways and many more of canals, and the allowance has not even been thought of, much less allowed for. This allowance for curvature means this, that it is 8 inches for the first mile of a canal, and increasing at the ratio by the square of the distance in miles. Thus a small navigable canal for boats, say 30 miles long, will have, by the above rule, an allowance for curvature of 600 feet. Think of that, and then please credit engineers as not being quite such fools. Nothing of the sort is allowed. We no more think of allowing 600 feet for a line of 30 miles of railway or canal than of wasting our time trying to square the circle. The Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Gulf of Suez on the Red Sea, is a clear proof of the earth's and water's non-convexity. The canal is 100 miles long, and without any locks, so the water within is an uninterrupted continuation of the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. When it was constructed, the earth's supposed curvature was not taken into account. It was dug along a horizontal datum line, 26 feet below sea level, passing through several lakes from one sea to the other, with the datum line and the water's surface running perfectly parallel over the 100 miles. The average level of the Mediterranean is 6 inches above the Red Sea, while the flood tides in the Red Sea rise 4 feet above the highest and drop 3 feet below the lowest in the Mediterranean, making the half-tide level of the Red Sea the surface of the Mediterranean Sea, and the 100 miles of water in the canal all a clear continuation of the same horizontal line. Were they instead the supposed curved line of globe-earthers, the water in the center of the canal would be 1,666 feet above the respective seas on either side. David Wardlaw Scott wrote, "The distance between the Red Sea at Suez and the Mediterranean Sea is 100 statute miles, the datum line of the canal being 26 feet below the level of the Mediterranean, and is continued horizontally the whole way from sea to sea, there not being a single lock on the canal. The surface of water being parallel with the datum line, it is thus clear that there is no curvature or globularity for the whole 100 miles between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Had there been, according to the astronomic theory, the middle of the canal would have been 1,666 feet higher than at either end, whereas the canal is perfectly horizontal for the whole distance. The Great Canal of China, said to be 700 miles in length, was made without regard to any allowance for supposed curvature, as the Chinese believe the Earth to be a stationary plane. I may also add that no allowance was made for it in the North Sea Canal or in the Manchester Ship Canal, both recently constructed, thus clearly proving that there is no globularity in earth or sea, so that the world cannot possibly be a planet. Thomas Winship wrote, "If the earth be the globe of popular belief, it is very evident that in cutting a canal an allowance must be made for the curvature of the globe, which allowance would correspond to the square of the distance multiplied by 8 inches. From the Age of 5th August 1892 I extract the following. The German Emperor performed the ceremony of opening the gates of the Baltic and North Sea Canal in the spring of 1891. The canal starts at Holtenau on the south side of Kiel Bay, and joins the Elbe 15 miles above its mouth. It is 61 miles long, 200 feet wide at the surface, and 85 feet at the bottom, the depth being 28 feet. No locks are required, as the surface of the two seas is level. Let those who believe it is the practice for surveyors to make allowance for curvature ponder over the following from the Manchester Ship Canal Company, Earth Review, October 1893. It is customary in railway and canal constructions for all levels to be referred to a datum which is nominally horizontal and is so shown on all sections. It is not the practice in laying out public works to make allowances for the curvature of the earth. The London and North Western Railway forms a straight line 180 miles long between London and Liverpool. The railroad's highest point, midway at Birmingham Station, is only 240 feet above sea level. If the world were actually a globe, however, curvating 8 inches per mile squared, the 180-mile stretch of rail would form an arc, with the center point at Birmingham raising a full 5,400 feet above London and Liverpool. Adding the station's actual height, 240 feet, to its theoretical inclination, 5,400 feet, gives 5,640 feet as the rail's necessary height on a globe Earth, more than 1,000 feet taller than Ben Nevis, the tallest mountain in Great Britain. Thomas Winship wrote, "In projecting railways on a globe, the datum line would be the arc of a circle corresponding to the latitude of the place. That the datum line for the railway projections is always a horizontal line proves that the general configuration of the world is horizontal. To support the globe theory, the gentlemen of the observatories should call upon the surveyor to prove that he allows the necessary amount for curvature, but this is what the learned men dare not do, as it is well known that the allowance for the supposed curvature is never made." David Wardlaw Scott wrote, "In a long line like that of the Great Pacific Railway, extending across North America, the supposed curvature would, of course, be proportionally great, extending to many miles in height, but not 1 inch was allowed by the engineers for curvature during the whole course of the construction of that vast line of railway. And if we think of it, how could it be otherwise? All railway metals must of necessity be straight, for how could any engine or carriage run with safety on a convex surface?" J.C. Bourne, in his book The History of the Great Western Railway, stated that the entire original English railroad, more than 118 miles long, that the whole line with the exception of the inclined planes, may be regarded practically as level. The British Parliament session in 1862, that approved its construction, recorded in Order No. 44 for the proposed railway, that "the section be drawn to the same horizontal scale as the plan, and to a vertical scale of not less than 1 inch to every 100 feet, and shall show the surface of the ground marked on the plan, the intended level of the proposed work, the height of every embankment, and the depth of every cutting, and a datum horizontal line which shall be the same throughout the whole length of the work." Thomas Winship wrote, 118 miles of level railway, and yet the surface on which it is projected a globe? Impossible. It cannot be. Early in 1898 I met a Mr. Hughes, chief officer of the steamer City of Lincoln. This gentleman told me he had projected thousands of miles of level railway in South America, and never heard of any allowance for curvature being made. On one occasion he surveyed over 1,000 miles of railway, which was a perfect straight line all the way. It is well known that in the Argentine Republic and other parts of South America there are railways thousands of miles long, without curve or gradient. In projecting railways, the world is acknowledged to be a plane, and if it were a globe, The rules of projection have yet to be discovered. Level railways prove a level world, to the utter confusion of the globular school of impractical men with high salaries and little brains. That in all surveys no allowance is made for curvature, which would be a necessity on a globe. That a horizontal line is in every case the datum line, the same line being continuous throughout the whole length of the work, and that the theodolite cuts a line at equal altitudes on either side of it, which altitude is the same as that of the instrument, clearly proves, to those who will accept proof when it is furnished, that the world is a plane and not a globe. If the earth were a sphere, airplane pilots would have to constantly correct their altitudes downwards so as to not fly straight off into outer space. If the earth were truly a sphere 25,000 miles in circumference, curvating 8 inches per mile squared, a pilot wishing to simply maintain their altitude at a typical cruising speed of 500 miles per hour would have to constantly dip their nose downwards and descend 2,777 feet, over half a mile, every minute. Otherwise, without compensation, in 1 hour's time, the pilot would find themselves 166,666 feet, 31.5 miles, higher than expected. A plane flying at a typical 35,000 feet, wishing to maintain that altitude at the upper rim of the so-called troposphere in 1 hour, would find themselves over 200,000 feet high in the mesosphere, with a steadily raising trajectory the longer they go. I have talked to several pilots, and no such compensation for the earth's supposed curvature is ever made. When pilots set an altitude, their artificial horizon gauge remains level, and so does their course. Nothing like the necessary 2,777 foot per minute declination is ever taken into consideration. Thomas Winship wrote, "It must be obvious to the reader that if the earth be the globe of popular belief, the rules observed for navigating a vessel from one part of this globe to another must be in conformity to its figure. The datum line in navigation would be an arc of a circle, and all computations would be based on the convexity of water and worked out by spherical trigonometry. Let me preface my remarks on the important branch of our subject by stating that at sea the datum line is always a horizontal line. Spherical trigonometry is never used, and not 1 out of 1,000 shipmasters understands spherical trigonometry. Airline pilots and sea navigators fly and sail as though the earth were a plane. Pilots reach their desired altitude and maintain it effortlessly for hours, never contending with anything like the 2,777 feet per minute of forced inclination due to Earth's supposed curvature. Similarly, ship captains in navigating great distances at sea never need to factor the supposed curvature of the earth into their calculations. Both plain sailing and great circle sailing, the most popular navigation methods, use plane, not spherical trigonometry. From Navigation and Nautical Astronomy, plain sailing is usually defined to be the art of navigating a ship on the supposition that the earth is a plane. Even when longitude enters into consideration, it is still with the plane triangle only that we have to deal. But as the investigation here given in the text shows, the rules for plain sailing would equally hold good though the surface were a plane. Thomas Winship wrote, "It must be evident to everyone who understands what a triangle is, that the base of any such figure on a globe would be an arc of a circle, of which the center would be the center of the globe. Thus, instead of a plane triangle, the figure would contain one plane angle and two spherical angles. Hence, if the plane triangle is what we have to deal with, and such is the case, the base of the triangle would be a straight line, the ocean. That all triangulation used at sea is plane proves that the sea is a plane. The foregoing quotation states that a plane triangle is used for a spherical surface, but the rules for plane sailing would equally hold good though the surface were a plane. What fine reasoning! It is like saying that the rules for describing a circle are those used for drawing a square, but they would equally hold good though the figure were a square. Plain sailing is navigating a ship making all mathematical calculations on the assumption that the earth is perfectly flat. If the earth were, in fact, a sphere, such an errant assumption would lead to constant glaring inaccuracies, and the necessity for using spherical trigonometry would become obvious. Plain sailing has worked perfectly fine in both theory and practice for thousands of years, however, and plane trigonometry has time and again proven more accurate than spherical trigonometry in determining distances across the oceans. It is so commonly used at sea. Navigation in theory and practice states that, in practice, scarcely any other rules are used but those derived from plain sailing. The great and serious objection to plain sailing is that longitude cannot be found by it accurately, although in practice it is more frequently found by it than any other method. So both latitude and longitude are found most often and most accurately by assuming the earth to be flat, more accurately even than assuming the earth to be spherical. Thomas Winship wrote, "Plain sailing proves that the surface of water is a plane or horizontal surface, and in practice it is shown that this plane extends for many thousands of miles. Whether the voyage is outwards or homewards makes no difference, thus showing that a short voyage to the Cape and back to England can be accomplished by plain sailing. The fact that water is flat like a sheet of paper, when undisturbed by wind and tide, is my working anchor, and the powerful ground tackle of all those who reject the delusions of modern theoretical astronomy. Prove water to be convex, and we will at once and forever recant and grant you anything you like to demand." William Carpenter wrote, "If the earth were a globe, a small model globe would be the very best, because the truest thing for the navigator to take to sea with him. But such a thing as that is not known. With such a toy as a guide, the mariner would wreck his ship of a certainty. This is a proof that the earth is not a globe. As the mariner's compass points north and south at one and the same time, and a meridian is a north and south line, it follows that meridians can be no other than straight lines. But since all meridians on a globe are semicircles, it is an incontrovertible proof that the earth is not a globe." And David Wardlaw Scott wrote, "The needle of this most important instrument is straight, its two ends pointing north and south at the same time. Consequently, the meridians must also be straight lines, whereas on a globe they are semicircles. Even at the equator, the needle points straight, which would be impossible, were that the midway of a vast convex globe, as in such case the one end would dip towards the north, and the other be pointed towards the sky. Again, the navigator, when he goes to sea, takes his observations and relies on the compass to guide him as to the direction in which he wishes to proceed. He does not provide himself with the model of a globe, which, if the world were a globe, would surely be the safest plan for him to adopt, but he takes flat maps or charts. Thus, in practice, he sails his ship as if the sea were horizontal, though in theory he had been erroneously taught that it is convex." In the flat Earth model of the cosmos, the North Pole is the immovable center of the world and the entire universe. Polaris, the North Star, sits straight over the North Pole at the highest point in the heavens, and like a slowly rotating planetarium dome, all the celestial bodies revolve around Polaris and over the Earth once per day. The sun circles over and around the circumference of Earth every 24 hours, steadily traveling each day from the equator during the March vernal equinox up to the Tropic of Cancer at the June summer solstice, back down to the equator for the September autumnal equinox, and all the way down to the Tropic of Capricorn on the December winter solstice. In the flat Earth model, the South Pole does not exist at all, and Antarctica is instead a gigantic ice wall extending the circumference of Earth, holding in the oceans like a giant bowl or a world cup. As strange as this concept may sound at first, it is a fact that if you set a bearing due south from anywhere on Earth, inevitably at or before 78 degrees southern latitude, you will find yourself face to face with an enormous ice wall towering 100 to 200 feet in the air, extending to the east and west the entire circumference of the world. General Greely, in Antarctica or the Hypothetical Southern Continent, wrote, "The ice barrier, so frequently referred to in accounts of the Antarctic regions, is the forefront of the enormous glacier covering or ice cap, which, accumulating in vast undulating fields from the heavy snowfall, and ultimately attaining hundreds if not thousands of feet in thickness, creeps from the continent of Antarctica into the polar sea. The ice barrier, yet a part of the parent ice cap, presents itself to the navigator who has boldness enough to approach its fearful front as a solid perpendicular wall of marble-like ice, ranging from 1,000 to 2,000 feet in thickness, of which from 100 to 200 feet rises above, and from 800 to 1,800 feet sinks below the level of the sea. Dr. Samuel Robotham wrote, "It has been demonstrated that the earth is a plane, the surface center of which is immediately underneath the star called Polaris, and the extremities of which are bounded by a vast region of ice and water and irregular masses of land. The whole terminates in fog and darkness, where snow and driving hail, piercing sleet, and boisterous winds, howling storms, madly mounting waves, and clashing icebergs are almost constant. Antarctica is not the tiny ice continent found confined to the underside antipode of astronomers' globes. Quite the contrary, Antarctica literally surrounds us 360 degrees, encircles every continent, and acts as a barrier holding in the oceans. The most commonly asked questions, and the greatest mysteries yet to be solved, are: how far does the Antarctic ice extend outwards? Is there a limit? What lies beyond, or is it just snow and ice forever? Thanks to UN treaties and constant military surveillance, the North Pole and Antarctica remain cloaked in government secrecy, both purported no-fly and no-sail zones, with several reports of civilian pilots and captains being shooed away and escorted back under threats of violence. Dr. Samuel Robotham wrote, "How far the ice extends, how it terminates, and what exists beyond it, are questions to which no present human experience can reply. All we at present know is, that snow and hail, howling winds, and indescribable storms and hurricanes prevail, and that in every direction human ingress is barred by unsealed escarpments of perpetual ice, extending farther than the eye or telescope can penetrate, and becoming lost in gloom and darkness." Before reaching the Antarctic ice wall, navigating the increasingly tumultuous southern oceans, explorers encounter the longest, darkest, coldest nights and the most dangerous seas and storms anywhere on earth. Vasco da Gama, an early 16th century Portuguese explorer of the South Seas, wrote how the waves rise like mountains in height, ships are heaved up to the clouds, and apparently precipitated by circling whirlpools to the bed of the ocean. The winds are piercing cold, and so boisterous that the pilot's voice can seldom be heard, whilst a dismal and almost continual darkness adds greatly to the danger. In 1773, Captain Cook became the first modern explorer known to have breached the Antarctic Circle and reached the ice barrier. During 3 voyages lasting 3 years and 8 days, Captain Cook and his crew sailed a total of 60,000 miles along the Antarctic coastline, never once finding an inlet or path through or beyond the massive glacial wall. Captain Cook wrote, "The ice extended east and west far beyond the reach of our sight, while the southern half of the horizon was illuminated by rays of light, which were reflected from the ice to a considerable height. It was indeed my opinion that this ice extends quite to the pole, or perhaps joins some land to which it has been fixed since creation." On October 5, 1839, another explorer, James Clark Ross, began a series of Antarctic voyages lasting a total of 4 years and 5 months. Ross and his crew sailed 2 heavily armored warships thousands of miles, losing many men from hurricanes and icebergs, looking for an entry point beyond the southern glacial wall. Upon first confronting the massive barrier, Captain Ross wrote of the wall, "Extending from its eastern extreme point as far as the eye could discern to the eastward, it presented an extraordinary appearance, gradually increasing in height as we got nearer to it, and proving at length to be a perpendicular cliff of ice, between 150 feet and 200 feet above the level of the sea, perfectly flat and level at the top, and without any fissures or promontories on its even seaward face. We might with equal chance of success try to sail through the cliffs of Dover as penetrate such a mass." William Carpenter wrote, "Yes, but we can circumnavigate the south easily enough, is often said by those who don't know. The British ship Challenger recently completed the circuit of the southern region, indirectly to be sure, but she was 3 years about it, and traversed nearly 69,000 miles, a stretch long enough to have taken her 6 times round on the globular hypothesis. Dr. Samuel Rowbotham wrote, "If we now consider the fact that when we travel by land or sea, and from any part of the known world in a direction towards the north polar star, we shall arrive at one and the same point, we are forced to the conclusion that what has hitherto been called the north polar region is really the center of the earth; that from this northern center the land diverges and stretches out, of necessity, towards a circumference which must now be called the southern region, which is a vast circle, and not a pole or center. In this and other ways all the great navigators have been frustrated in their efforts, and have been more or less confounded in their attempts to sail round the earth upon or beyond the Antarctic Circle. But if the southern region is a pole or center, like the north, there would be little difficulty in circumnavigating it, for the distance round would be comparatively small. When it is seen that the earth is not a sphere, but a plane, having only one center, the north, and that the south is the vast icy boundary of the world, the difficulties experienced by circumnavigators can be easily understood. If the earth were truly a globe, then every line of latitude south of the equator would have to measure a gradually smaller and smaller circumference the farther south traveled. In other words, the circumference at 10 degrees south latitude would comprise a smaller circle than at the equator, 20 degrees south latitude would comprise a circle smaller than 10, and so on. If, however, the earth is an extended plane, then every line of latitude south of the equator should measure a gradually larger and larger circumference the farther south traveled. 10 degrees south latitude will comprise a larger circle than the equator, 20 degrees south latitude will comprise a circle larger than 10, and so on. Likewise, if the earth were a globe, lines of longitude would bubble out at the equator while converging at the poles, whereas if earth is an extended plane, lines of longitude should simply expand straight outwards from the North Pole. So which is actually the case? David Wardlaw Scott wrote, "Upon the principle as taught by Scripture and common observation that the world is not a planet but consists of vast masses of land stretched out upon level seas, the north being the center of the system, it is evident that the degrees of longitude will gradually increase in width the whole way from the north center to the icy boundary of the great southern circumference, in consequence of the difference between the actual extent of longitudes and that allowed for them by the nautical authorities, which difference, at the latitude of the Cape of Good Hope, has been estimated to amount to a great number of miles. Many shipmasters have lost their reckoning, and many vessels have been wrecked. Ship captains, who have been educated in the globular theory, know not how to account for their getting so much out of their course in southern latitudes, and generally put it down to currents. But this reason is futile, for although currents may exist, they do not usually run in opposite directions, and vessels are frequently wrecked whether sailing east or west." During Captain James Clark Ross's voyages around the Antarctic circumference, he often wrote in his journal, perplexed at how they routinely found themselves out of accordance with their charts, stating that they found themselves an average of 12 to 16 miles outside their reckoning every day, some days as much as 29 miles. Lieutenant Charles Wilkes commanded a United States Navy exploration expedition to the Antarctic from August 18, 1838 to June 10, 1842. Almost 4 years spent exploring and surveying the Southern Ocean. In his journals, Lieutenant Wilkes also mentioned being consistently east of his reckoning, sometimes over 20 miles in less than 18 hours. Dr. Samuel Rowbotham wrote, "The commanders of these various expeditions were, of course, with their education and belief in the earth's rotundity, unable to conceive of any other cause for the differences between log and chronometer results than the existence of currents. But one simple fact is entirely fatal to such an explanation, that when the route taken is east or west, the same results are experienced. The water of the southern region cannot be running in two opposite directions at the same time, and hence, although various local and variable currents have been noticed, they cannot be shown to be the cause of the discrepancies so generally observed in high southern latitudes between time and log results." The conclusion is one of necessity, forced upon us by the sum of the evidence collected that the degrees of longitude in any given southern latitude are larger than the degrees in any latitude nearer to the northern center, thus proving the already more than sufficiently demonstrated fact that the earth is a plane, having a northern center, in relation to which degrees of latitude are concentric, and from which degrees of longitude are diverging lines, continually increasing in their distance from each other as they are prolonged towards the great glacial southern circumference. Rev. Thomas Milner wrote, "In the southern hemisphere, navigators to India have often fancied themselves east of the Cape when still west, and have been driven ashore on the African coast, which, according to their reckoning, lay behind them. This misfortune happened to a fine frigate, the Challenger, in 1845. How came Her Majesty's ship Conqueror to be lost? How have so many other noble vessels, perfectly sound, perfectly manned, perfectly navigated, been wrecked in calm weather, not only in dark night or in a fog, but in broad daylight and sunshine, in the former case upon the coasts, in the latter upon sunken rocks, from being out of reckoning, under circumstances which until now have baffled every satisfactory explanation? The equatorial circumference of the supposed ball earth is said to be 24,900 statute, or 21,600 nautical miles. A nautical mile is the distance following the supposed curvature of the earth from 1 minute of latitude to the next. A statute mile is the straight line distance between the two, not taking into account earth's alleged curvature. The Australian Handbook, Almanac Shippers and Importers Directory, states that the distance between Sydney and Nelson is 1,400 nautical, or 1,633 statute miles. Allowing a more than sufficient 83 miles as the distance for rounding Cape Farewell and sailing up Tasman Bay to Nelson, leaves 1,550 statute miles as the straight line distance from the meridian of Sydney to the meridian of Nelson. Their given difference in longitude is 22 degrees 2 minutes 14 seconds. Therefore, if 22 degrees 2 minutes 14 seconds out of 360 is 1,550 miles, the entirety measures 25,182 miles. This is larger than the earth is said to be at the equator, and 4,262 miles greater than it would be at Sydney's southern latitude on a globe of said proportions. 1/360th part of 25,182 gives 70 miles as the distance between each degree of longitude at Sydney's 34° southern latitude. On a globe 25,000 miles in equatorial circumference, however, degrees of longitude at 34° latitude would be only 58 miles, a full 12 miles per degree less than reality. This perfectly explains why Ross and other navigators in the deep south experienced 12+ mile daily discrepancies between their reckoning and reality. The farther south traveled, the farther the divide. Dr. Samuel Robotham wrote, "From near Cape Horn, Chile, to Port Phillip in Melbourne, Australia, the distance is 9,000 miles. These two places are 143 degrees of longitude from each other. Therefore the whole extent of the earth's circumference is a mere arithmetical question. If 143 degrees make 9,000 miles, what will be the distance made by the whole 360 degrees into which the surface is divided? The answer is 22,657 miles, or 8,357 miles more than the theory of rotundity would permit. It must be borne in mind, however, that the above distances are nautical measure, which, reduced to statute miles, gives the actual distance round the southern region at a given latitude as 26,433 statute miles, or nearly 1,500 miles more than the largest circumference ever assigned to the earth at the equator. Similar calculations made from the Cape of Good Hope, South Africa, to Melbourne, Australia, at an average latitude of 35.5 degrees south, have given an approximate figure of over 25,000 miles, which is again equal to or greater than the earth's supposed greatest circumference at the equator. Calculations from Sydney, Australia, to Wellington, New Zealand, at an average of 37.5 degrees south, have given an approximate circumference of 25,500 miles, greater still. According to the ball Earth theory, the circumference of the Earth at 37.5 degrees southern latitude should be only 19,757 statute miles, almost 6,000 miles less than such practical measurements. Dr. Samuel Robotham wrote, "The above calculations are, as already stated, only approximate, but as liberal allowances have been made for irregularities of route, etc., they are sufficiently accurate to prove that the degrees of longitude, as we proceed southwards, do not diminish, as they would upon a globe, but expand or increase, as they must if the earth is a plane, or, in other words, the farthest point, or greatest latitude south, must have the greatest circumference and degrees of longitude." And William Carpenter wrote, "Parallels of latitude only, of all imaginary lines on the surface of the earth, are circles, which increase progressively from the northern center to the southern circumference. The mariner's course in the direction of any one of these concentric circles is his longitude, the degrees of which increase to such an extent beyond the equator, going southwards, that hundreds of vessels have been wrecked because of the false idea created by the untruthfulness of the charts and the globular theory together, causing the sailor to be continually getting out of his reckoning. With a map of the earth in its true form, all difficulty is done away with, and ships may be conducted anywhere with perfect safety. This, then, is a very important practical proof that the earth is not a globe."
I phoned up Antarctica. There's like a tourist umbrella you have to go through, and I sort of said, "Oh, I've got loads of money. I've got boats in Hawaii and India," which I don't. And me and some friends were going to hack down to Antarctica and walk across it. And I got loads of emails of these people saying, "No, you don't. No, you don't. Fill out your permits. You've got Orange membership. And fill out this. Why are you coming?" I got like totally hammered just for saying I'm coming to Antarctica. What I found is you're only allowed in through New Zealand, South America at the bottom, and South Africa at the bottom. And they take you in, you see some penguins, you sleep somewhere cold, and they throw you back out, all for like $5,000. Now, it's totally locked down, and I did an article about it where I looked at the Treaty of Antarctica, which is some countries got together and locked it down. They've got a lot of science research going on there, and they just don't let anyone in. Now, where this treaty meet, they have a big table that's shaped in a pyramid with the top cut off. Which is, you can call me a conspiracy theorist, but there's obviously something there. What would you like to add on the Antarctica rim model, Eric?
Yeah, so Antarctica is not just the tiny ice continent on the bottom of the globe that it shows, but it is the case that no matter where you are on Earth, if you go southwards from there, you'll hit Antarctica. So if you imagine expanding that little Antarctic continent on the bottom of the globe out to an ice rim all the way across, around the Earth, rather, the North Pole being in the center, anywhere you go in a straight line, you will end up going to the ice wall.
Yeah, and many boats through, since the 40s, 50s have talked about my instruments went crazy, there were ice walls for hundreds of miles, I got lost. There's so many of these stories.
Yeah, and so they say that there's a South Pole somewhere too on part of that guided tour that you're talking about. They've got an arbitrary point along the Antarctic ice that they've put a red and white barbershop pole with a ball earth on top of it and claim that that's the South Pole. But they even admit that it's not the real South Pole because the real geomagnetic South Pole is constantly moving. So since it's constantly moving, you're never really going to be able to see it. But the reality is they can't have people going down there with a compass and checking to see if it really is the South Pole.
Last year, Prince Harry was down there, and he basically just made some filming. He was with Rupert and Tarquin and a few of his friends. And the story was, it was on all the mainstream news, Prince Harry in Antarctica. Oh, we had to go back, it was just too cold, my foot got blisters and frostbite. What the message to the subconscious is, it doesn't matter how rich you are, don't go there, it's too cold.
They know that Prince Harry and a team of injured servicemen and women have been walking to the South Pole. Well, they've got there, they've completed the 200-mile Walking with the Wounded South Pole Challenge, that's its proper name. They've spent more than 3 weeks trekking through Antarctica, and this was what it sounded like at the moment when they arrived at the bottom of the world.
Let's go!
it sounds quite restrained, doesn't it, after all that effort? Well, they spent 20 hours in a cold chamber. This was the prince and the other competitors who were with him to prepare for the conditions that they were going to find down there. The expedition was supposed to be a race. You might remember it being billed that way before it started, but the weather became so bad as they went along that they scrapped the competitive side of things and just joined up as one big team instead. And this was how Harry reacted after completing the mission.
We're here, we made it. It's Friday the 13th. We've had so many things go against us. We've had beautiful weather, but bad weather before, and bad terrain and injuries and stuff like that. But everyone's made it, all 12 of them, the whole group of 20, whatever it is. But the 12 wounded soldiers have made it. Couldn't have made it without everyone's help, especially back home. You know, the founders, Ed and Simon as well. But everyone is so happy. Everyone's touched the ball. We've all had photos. We've all had hugs, a few tears here and there. But all in all, mission success, basically.
If you're wondering about that ball that he was talking about, it's the ceremonial South Pole at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. It's like a metal sphere on a red and white pole, and it's partly surrounded by the flags of the signatories of the Antarctic Treaty. So it's lovely for a photo, but the problem with it is it's not the real South Pole. It's about 300 metres away.
So at the real South Pole, what is that?
Well, there's nothing. That's the thing. You can't see. To do it properly, to cover all your bases, you have to do both. You have to do the picture with the ball, and then you have to go and kind of hang around at the exact
why don't they move
longitude
the
and
ball to
latitude.
where the actual thing is?
Well, that's a very sensible question. It's not one I can answer, but it's a very good.
If the Earth were truly a globe, the Arctic and Antarctic polar regions and areas of comparable latitude north and south of the equator should share similar conditions and characteristics such as comparable temperatures, seasonal changes, length of daylight, plant and animal life. In reality, however, the Arctic and Antarctic regions and areas of comparable latitude north and south of the equator differ greatly in many ways. Thomas Winship says, "If the Earth be the globe of popular belief, the same amount of heat and cold, summer and winter, should be experienced at the same latitudes north and south of the equator. The same number of plants and animals would be found, and the same general conditions exist. That the very opposite is the case disproves the globular assumption. The great contrasts between places at the same latitudes north and south of the equator is a strong argument against the received doctrine of the rotundity of the Earth. Antarctica is by far the coldest place on Earth, with an average annual temperature of approximately -57 degrees Fahrenheit and a record low of 135.8. The average annual temperature at the North Pole, however, is a comparatively warm 4 degrees. Throughout the year, temperatures in the Antarctic vary less than half the amount at comparable Arctic latitudes. The northern Arctic region enjoys moderately warm summers and manageable winters, whereas the southern Antarctic region never even warms enough to melt the perpetual snow and ice." Thomas Winship wrote, "This uniformity of temperature partly accounts for the great accumulation of ice which is formed, not on account of the great severity of the winter, but because there is practically no summer to melt it. In the Antarctic there is eternal winter, and snow never melts. As far north as a man has traveled, he has found reindeer and hare basking in the sun, and country brilliant with rich flora. Within the Antarctic Circle, no plant is to be found. The island of Kerguelen at 49 degrees southern latitude has only 18 species of native plants that can survive its hostile climate. Compare this with the island of Iceland at 65 degrees northern latitude. 16 degrees further north of the equator than Kerguelen is south, yet Iceland is home to 870 species of native plants. On the Isle of Georgia, just 54 degrees southern latitude, the same latitude as Canada or England in the north, where dense forests of various tall trees abound, the infamous Captain Cook wrote that he was unable to find a single shrub large enough to make a toothpick. Cook wrote, "Not a tree was to be seen. The lands which lie to the south are doomed by nature to perpetual frigidness, never to feel the warmth of the sun's rays, whose horrible and savage aspect I have not words to describe. Even marine life is sparse in certain tracts of vast extent, and the sea-bird is seldom observed flying over such lonely wastes. The contrasts between the limits of organic life in Arctic and Antarctic zones is very remarkable and significant. Vegetables and land animals are found at nearly 80 degrees in the north, while from the parallel of 58 degrees in the south, the lichen and such-like plants only clothe the rocks, and seabirds and the cetaceous tribes alone are seen upon the desolate beaches. In the Arctic there are 4 clearly distinguished seasons, warm summers, and an abundance of plant and animal life, none of which can be said of the Antarctic. The Eskimo live as far north as the 79th parallel, whereas in the south no native man is found higher than the 56th. Admiral Ferdinand von Wrangel, the 19th century Russian Arctic explorer, wrote how in the north countless herds of reindeer, elks, black bears, foxes, sable, and gray squirrels fill the upland forests. Stone foxes and wolves roam over the low ground. Enormous flights of swans, geese, and ducks arrive in spring, and seek deserts where they may molt and build their nests in safety. Eagles, gulls, and owls pursue their prey along the sea coast. Ptarmigan run in troops among the bushes. Little snipes are busy among the brooks and in the morasses. The social crows seek the neighborhood of man's habitations, and when the sun shines in spring one may sometimes even hear the cheerful note of the finch, and in autumn that of the thrush. W.N.R. Chambers, in Arctic Explorations, wrote, "Beyond the 70th degree of southern latitude, not a tree meets the eye. Wearied with the white waste of snow, forests, woods, even shrubs have disappeared, and given place to a few lichens and creeping woody plants, which scantily clothe the indurated soil. Still, in the farthest north, nature claims her birthright of beauty, and in the brief and rapid summer she brings forth numerous flowers and grasses to bloom for a few days, to be again blasted by the swiftly recurring winter. The rapid fervor of an Arctic summer had already, June 1st, converted the snowy waste into luxuriant pasture ground, rich in flowers and grass, with almost the same lively appearance as that of an English meadow." In New Zealand, situated at 42 degrees southern latitude, on the winter solstice the sun rises at 4:31 a.m. and sets at 7:29 p.m., making the longest day of the year 14 hours and 58 minutes. On the summer solstice, the New Zealand sun rises at 7:29 a.m. and sets at 4:31 p.m., making the shortest day 9 hours and 2 minutes long. Meanwhile, in England, a full 10 degrees farther north of the equator than New Zealand lies south, the longest day is 16 hours and 34 minutes, the shortest day 7 hours and 45 minutes. Therefore, the longest day in New Zealand is 1 hour and 36 minutes shorter than the longest day in England, and the shortest day in New Zealand is 1 hour and 17 minutes longer than the shortest day in England. William Swainson, an Englishman who emigrated and became Attorney General of New Zealand in the mid-19th century, lived in both countries for decades and wrote of their differences, stating, "The range of temperature is limited, there being no excess of either heat or cold. Compared with the climate of England, the summer of New Zealand is but very little warmer, though considerably longer. Even in summer, people here have no notion of going without fires in the evening. But then, though the days are very warm and sunny, the nights are always cold. For 7 months last summer we had not one day that the sun did not shine as brilliantly as it does in England in the finest day in June, and though it has more power here, the heat is not nearly so oppressive. But then there is not the twilight which you get in England. Here it is light till about 8 o'clock, then in a few minutes it becomes too dark to see anything, and the change comes over in almost no time. The seasons are the reverse of those in England. Spring commences in September, summer in December, autumn in April, and winter in June. The days are an hour shorter at each end of the day in summer, and an hour longer in the winter than in England." In the flat earth model of the cosmos, these Arctic and Antarctic phenomena are easily accounted for and exactly what would be expected. If the sun circles over and around the earth every 24 hours, steadily traveling from tropic to tropic every 6 months, it follows that the northern, central region would annually receive far more heat and sunlight than the southern circumferential region. Since the sun must sweep over the larger southern region in the same 24 hours it has to pass over the smaller northern region, its passage must necessarily be proportionally faster as well. This is why the Antarctic morning dawn and evening twilight are very abrupt, whereas in extreme north, twilight continues for hours after sunset, and many midsummer nights the sun does not set at all. Dr. Samuel Robotham said, "If the sun is fixed and the earth revolves underneath it, the same phenomena would exist at the same distance on each side of the equator. But such is not the case. What can operate to cause the twilight in New Zealand to be so much more sudden, or the nights so much colder than in England? The southern hemisphere cannot revolve more rapidly than the northern. The latitudes are about the same, and the distance round a globe would be the same at 50 degrees south as at 50 degrees north, and as the whole would revolve once in 24 hours, the surface at the two places would pass underneath the sun with the same velocity, and the light would approach in the morning, and recede in the evening in exactly the same manner. Yet the very contrary is the fact. The constant sunlight of the north develops, with the utmost rapidity, numerous forms of vegetable life, and furnishes subsistence for millions of living creatures. But in the south, where the sunlight never dwells, or lingers about a central region, but rapidly sweeps over sea and land, to complete in 24 hours the great circle of the southern circumference, it has not time to excite and stimulate the surface, and therefore, even in comparatively low southern latitudes, everything wears an aspect of desolation. These differences in the north and south could not exist if the earth were a globe, turning upon axes underneath a non-moving sun. The two hemispheres would at the same latitudes have the same degree of light and heat, and the same general phenomena, both in kind and degree. The peculiarities which are found in the south as compared with the north are only such as could exist upon a stationary plane, having a northern center, concentric with which is the path of the moving sun." And William Carpenter wrote, "Every year the sun is as long south of the equator as he is north, and if the earth were not stretched out as it is, in fact, but turned under, as the Newtonian theory suggests, it would certainly get as intensive a share of the sun's rays south as north. But the southern region being, in consequence of the fact stated, far more extensive than the region north, the sun, having to complete his journey round every 24 hours, travels quicker as he goes further south, from September to December, and his influence has less time in which to accumulate at any given point. Since, then, the facts could not be as they are if the earth were a globe, it is a proof that the earth is not a globe." During Arctic summer, from approximately the 22nd to the 25th of June, at a high enough latitude and altitude, you can watch a phenomenon known as the midnight sun, where the sun stays continuously visible in the sky for 3 days straight. The midnight sun rises on the 22nd, and for the next 72 hours never disappears from sight, slowly ascending and descending every 12 hours, showing 3 brilliant sunsets and sunrises without ever actually setting below the horizon. In the Brighton Examiner of July 1870, United States Ambassador to Norway Mr. Campbell described his experience witnessing the midnight sun with a group of gentlemen on a cliff 1,000 feet above the Arctic Sea at the 69th north parallel. It was late but still sunlight. The Arctic Ocean stretched away in silent vastness at our feet. The sound of the waves scarcely reached our airy lookout. Away in the north the huge old sun swung low along the horizon, like the slow beat of the tall clock in our grandfather's parlor corner. We all stood silently, looking at our watches. When both hands stood together at 12 midnight, the full round orb hung triumphantly above the waves. A bridge of gold running due north spangled the water between us and him. There he shone in silent majesty, which knew no setting. We involuntarily took off our hats. No word was said. Combine the most brilliant sunrise you ever saw, and its beauties will pall before the gorgeous coloring which lit up the ocean, heaven, and mountains. In half an hour the sun had swung up perceptibly on its beat. The colors had changed to those of morning. A fresh breeze had rippled over the florid sea. One songster after another piped out of the ground behind us. We had slid into another day. From The Land of the Midnight Sun. Tourists from Haparanda prefer going to Ayasaksa, a hill 680 feet above the sea, from which, through 8 or 10 miles south of the Arctic Circle, they can see the midnight sun for 3 days. As the voyage drew to a close, and we approached the upper end of the Gulf of Bothnia, The twilight had disappeared, and between the setting and rising of the sun hardly 1 hour elapsed. Haparanda is in 65 degrees 31 minutes north latitude and 41 miles south of the Arctic Circle. It is 1 degree 18 minutes farther north than Archangel and in the same latitude as the most northern part of Iceland. The sun rises on the 21st of June at 12:01 a.m. and sets at 11:37 p.m. From the 22nd to the 25th of June, the traveler may enjoy the sight of the midnight sun from Avasaksa, a hill 680 feet high and about 45 miles distant. If the Earth were actually a spinning globe revolving around the sun, the only place such a phenomena as the midnight sun could be observed would be at the poles. Any other vantage point from 89 degrees latitude downwards could never, regardless of any tilt or inclination, see the sun for 24 hours straight. To see the sun for an entire revolution on a spinning globe at a point other than the poles, you would have to be looking through miles and miles of land and sea for part of the revolution. Anyone below the 89th parallel could never witness the sun for 72 hours, 3 whole revolutions, straight, because to do so would be to assume you are somehow seeing through the globe and to the sun on the other side. Since such an assumption is ridiculous, and yet the midnight sun can clearly be seen as low as the 65th parallel, this is another absolute proof that the Earth is the flat, stationary center of the universe. Thomas Winship wrote, "If the Earth be a globe, at midnight the eye would have to penetrate thousands of miles of land and water, even at 65 degrees north latitude, in order to see the sun at midnight. That the sun can be seen for days together in the far north during the northern summer proves that there is something very seriously wrong with the globular hypothesis. Besides this, how is it that the midnight sun is never seen in the south during the southern summer? Cook penetrated as far south as 71 degrees, Weddell in 1893 reached as far as 74 degrees, and Sir James C. Ross in 1841 and 1842 reached the 78th parallel. But I am not aware that any of these navigators have left it on record that the sun was seen at midnight in the south." Heliocentrists also cannot explain why the midnight sun phenomena is not experienced anywhere in the southern hemisphere at any time of year. Quite to the contrary, it has been recorded by the Royal Belgian Geographical Society in Expedition Antarctique Belge that during the most severe part of the Antarctic winter, from 71 degrees south latitude onwards, the sun sets on May 17th and is not seen above the horizon again until July 21st. This is completely at odds with the ball Earth theory, but easily explained by the flat Earth model. The midnight sun is seen from high altitudes in extreme northern latitudes during Arctic summer because the sun, at its innermost cycle, is circling tightly enough around the polar center that it remains visible above the horizon for someone at such a vantage point. Likewise, in extreme southern latitudes, during Arctic summer, the sun completely disappears from view for over 2 months, because there, at the northern tropic, at the innermost arc of its boomerang journey, the sun is circling the northern center too tightly to be seen from the southern circumference.